I always thought my mom and I shared an unbreakable bond, a connection forged in childhood, in a home where her love was a constant, unwavering presence. Growing up, she was my rock, my safe haven, the person who could always light up my darkest days. I remember how her gentle voice would lull me to sleep with bedtime stories and how her laughter filled our small kitchen during weekend breakfasts. I trusted her implicitly, believing that our relationship was built on unconditional love and care. But as I stepped into adulthood and moved out to start my own life, something began to shift. It wasn't dramatic at first, it was the kind of change that sneaks up on you when you're not looking. I started noticing small, inexplicable lapses in our communication. Phone calls became less frequent, and when we did talk, there was a strange distance in her tone. I would occasionally find things, small personal items of mine, in places I never expected, like a scarf in a drawer I didn't remember using or a pair of headphones tucked away behind old photo albums. I chalked these up to the inevitable friction that arises when old roles change and families adjust to new routines. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing more than misunderstandings. After all, moving out is a big change for everyone involved, and I assumed she was simply adapting to having me around less. Yet, whispers and vague rumors began to circulate among our mutual acquaintances, hinting that things weren't quite as they should be. I heard snippets of conversations, at the grocery store or over coffee with a friend, where my mom's actions were described in hushed, confused tones. I wondered if I was imagining things, if my own insecurity about living independently was clouding my judgment. For months, I tried to ignore the nagging feeling that something was off. I continued with my daily routine, going to work, returning home, and catching up with friends, all the while maintaining the belief that my mom and I were fine. But there was an undercurrent of tension that I couldn't quite place. Every so often, I'd catch her looking at me with an expression I couldn't decipher, a mix of sadness and something else, something like regret. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it made me uneasy. Then came that fateful afternoon, a day that would shatter the fragile comfort I had clung to for so long. I returned home from work, exhausted from a long day and expecting nothing more than a quiet evening. The front door was slightly ajar, a small, unusual detail that immediately set my heart racing. I pushed it open, half expecting to hear the familiar hum of our home welcoming me back. Instead, I was met with an eerie silence. I stepped inside, each footstep echoing in the quiet hallway, until I reached the doorstep where I always left my keys. There, pinned to the door, was a handwritten note in my mom's familiar, looping script. I hesitated before picking it up, my hands trembling slightly as I unfolded the crumpled paper. The message was brief, but its impact was profound. It spoke of decisions made without my knowledge, of changes that had already begun, and it hinted at actions that I couldn't immediately comprehend. The words, though few, were laced with a cold detachment that I had never associated with the woman who had once been my unwavering pillar. In that moment, a rush of emotions overwhelmed me, confusion, betrayal, and a deep-seated sorrow that struck me to my core. I reread the note several times, each reading deepening the wound in my heart. I sat there on the stoop, the note clutched tightly in my hands, as a cold dread seeped into my bones. The very essence of our relationship, the bond one had so cherished, was unraveling before my eyes. Questions began to swirl in my mind. Why would she do this? What had I missed? And, most painfully, how could the person I had always trusted so completely betray me in such a subtle yet devastating way? In the days that followed, I found myself oscillating between disbelief and a desperate need for answers. I reached out to her, calling and texting, but her responses were evasive, filled with vague reassurances that did nothing to alleviate my growing anxiety. I recalled the warmth of her hugs and the sound of her laughter and wondered how they could now be so distant, almost foreign. The home I had left behind, once a sanctuary of unconditional love, was now tainted with uncertainty and suspicion. Every detail of that afternoon replayed in my mind, how the sunlight fell on the note, the way the paper crinkled under my fingers, and the unsettling emptiness that filled the room after I finished reading. I started scrutinizing every interaction I had with her over the past few months, searching for signs that I had overlooked. Had her quiet moments been laced with hidden meanings? Had her distant glances been silent pleas or warnings? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that our once solid foundation was showing cracks I had ignored, hoping they were just the natural wear of time rather than harbingers of something far more painful. I spent countless hours alone, grappling with the reality that my world was shifting in ways I never anticipated. In the solitude of my small apartment, I tried to piece together a coherent picture from the fragmented clues left behind. I questioned my own perceptions. Was I being overly sensitive, or was there truly something amiss in our relationship? The internal conflict was tormenting, each moment of self-doubt intensifying the sting of the note's revelation. The betrayal was not a loud, explosive event, it was a slow, corrosive process that had crept in through the cracks of our everyday lives. The note, a simple piece of paper, had become the symbol of that betrayal, a tangible reminder that the trust one had placed so completely in my mom was now in question. As I grappled with these thoughts, I felt a profound loneliness, a stark contrast to the security I had once known. I realized that the unbreakable bond one had taken for granted was not as resilient as I had believed. That afternoon marked the beginning of an emotional journey I never expected, a journey of unraveling truths, painful realizations, and the desperate need to confront the person who had once been my everything. I knew that the road ahead would be fraught with difficult conversations, heart-wrenching decisions, and the possibility of severing ties that I had assumed were forever. And yet, deep down, I understood that acknowledging this painful truth was the only way to begin healing. In that moment, standing on my doorstep with that damning note in my hand, I faced a future that was uncertain and bleak. I realized that sometimes the people we trust the most can become the ones who hurt us the deepest, and that the journey to reclaiming one's sense of self begins with confronting the painful cracks in the foundation of our most cherished relationships. When I finally absorbed the chilling implications of that note, I felt as though my entire world was crumbling around me. That seemingly innocuous piece of paper revealed a truth so devastating that it forced me to confront a betrayal I never thought possible. As I sat on the front steps, my heart pounding in disbelief, I began to piece together the horrifying puzzle. My mom had been selling my belongings, items I had trusted her to keep safe in storage when I moved out. I remember the shock that washed over me when I opened my email later that day and found a series of online listings. There were pictures of my prized guitar, the one I had spent years perfecting, and my cherished collection of books, each item meticulously displayed with price tags. The vibrant images of my guitar, now reduced to merchandise, blurred before my eyes as I struggled to reconcile this act of betrayal with the woman I had always known. Every promise she had made, every heartfelt assurance to safeguard my possessions until I was ready to reclaim them, echoed in my mind like distant, mocking whispers. I couldn't shake the image of her gentle smile during our last conversation about my belongings, her words filled with care and love, making me believe that nothing would ever harm what I had entrusted to her. Yet now, here they were, not just misplaced or forgotten, but actively sold, as if my memories and treasures were nothing more than items on clearance. I scrolled through the online listings with trembling fingers. One listing caught my attention immediately, a clear, high-resolution photo of my guitar, its familiar shape and intricate details unmistakable. The price was set, and the description was matter of fact, a blunt announcement that my instrument was available for purchase. I felt as if a cold blade had been drawn across my chest. My guitar was more than just wood and strings, it was a symbol of countless hours of practice, a repository of dreams and aspirations. It was the soundtrack of my late nights, my struggles, and my triumphs. Seeing it reduced to a mere commodity, sold by the person I once trusted unconditionally, sent a tidal wave of anguish crashing over me. My heart pounded even harder when I discovered another listing, a series of images featuring a neatly arranged shelf of books that I had painstakingly collected over the years. These were not ordinary books, but cherished editions that I had sought out and saved for, each one carrying a piece of my intellectual journey. They were meant to be my legacy, a part of who I was. Now, here they were, their spines lined up with price tags, as if I had never valued them at all. Every time I saw that photo, it was like reliving the betrayal over and over again. But the final, most devastating blow came when I learned about my laptop. The one I depended on for work, creative projects, and maintaining my connection to the world, the laptop that held my digital life, my documents, photos, and memories, had been pawned. I remember the precise moment I received the call from an old friend, a coworker who mentioned that a local pawn shop had recently acquired a laptop that looked exactly like mine. The realization hit me like a freight train. I felt an overwhelming mix of anger, betrayal, and helplessness. This wasn't a case of forgotten belongings or innocent misplacement. It was a calculated decision, a deliberate act that tore at the very fabric of the trust one had so carefully built over the years. I spent the next several hours in a haze, my mind reeling as I tried to come to terms with the magnitude of her actions. My thoughts raced back to every promise she had made, every assurance given with a tender smile. I recalled our heartfelt conversations about protecting my things, the quiet nods of understanding when I confided my worries about leaving my treasures behind. How could she, the person who was supposed to be my guardian and confidant, betray me in such a profound way? Tears blurred my vision as I began to understand that this was not a misunderstanding. There was no simple explanation or excuse that could justify selling off my most valued possessions and pawning my lifeline to the digital world. The betrayal was as deliberate as it was painful, a sharp incision into a bond one had once believed was unbreakable. I felt the weight of each lost item like a personal failure, even though I knew it wasn't my fault. The realization that someone so close to me had undermined my trust, turning my memories into items for sale, left me hollow and incredulous. In the solitude of that moment, I questioned everything, my judgment, her motives, and even my own capacity to love and trust. The act of selling my belongings, of pawning my laptop, symbolized a deeper fracture in our relationship. It was as though my mom had severed the ties that bound us, using my cherished possessions as leverage or perhaps as a misguided means to an end that I could never comprehend. I wondered if there had been signs I had missed, subtle hints in her behavior that now seemed painfully obvious. Yet, even as I replayed every interaction and every shared memory, the betrayal remained an unfathomable mystery. I made several attempts to reach out to her, to get some clarity on why she had done this, but each conversation left me more confused and more hurt. Her responses were evasive, often filled with platitudes that meant nothing in the face of the tangible evidence before me. The hurt in her eyes, the remorse that flickered for a fleeting second, was quickly masked by a cold detachment that made my heart sink further. It was as if she had compartmentalized our history, our bond, and the things that I held dear, treating them as mere transactions rather than as parts of my identity. As the reality set in, I felt an internal struggle between love and betrayal. On one hand, I yearned to believe that there was a logical explanation for her actions, a mistake born out of necessity or misguided intentions. On the other hand, the evidence was irrefutable, and the pain was overwhelming. I realized that the simple act of selling my belongings and pawning my laptop was more than just a breach of trust, it was a transformation of our relationship, one that I could no longer ignore or mend with words alone. That day marked a turning point for me. The discovery of those online listings, the sight of my guitar and my books being marketed as if they were items for sale, shattered the illusion that my mom and I still shared the deep, unspoken trust of our past. The betrayal was absolute, leaving me with a chasm that I feared might never be bridged. In that painful moment, I understood that sometimes, the ones we love the most can hurt us in ways that no amount of forgiveness can heal. In the aftermath of that discovery, I was forced to confront the painful truth about our relationship. The cherished memories and the warmth of our shared past now clashed with the stark reality of betrayal. The items I had once regarded as extensions of my identity were now symbols of a fractured bond, a reminder that the unbreakable bond one had taken for granted was, in fact, deeply fragile. And as I sat there, surrounded by the echo of my own disbelief and sorrow, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The next day, I couldn't let the weight of that discovery settle without confronting her. I woke early with a storm raging inside me, a heady mix of anger, disbelief, and deep sorrow. The morning light seeped through the blinds, but its warmth did nothing to dispel the chill that had gripped my heart. I knew what I had to do. I had to face her, the person I'd once trusted with every secret, every cherished memory. I found her in the kitchen, standing by the counter, as if she were waiting for me, though I couldn't tell if it was by design or fate. My pulse pounded in my ears as I stepped forward, unable to ignore the looming confrontation any longer. "Mom," I began, my voice trembling with a mixture of suppressed rage and raw hurt. Her eyes met mine, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of guilt there. But before I could press further, she quickly averted her gaze, as if she were suddenly burdened by an overwhelming shame. I couldn't hold back my frustration any longer. "I saw the listings, Mom. I saw my guitar, my books, and even my laptop pawned and sold like I never mattered," I said, my words spilling out in a torrent of accusation. Every syllable felt like a blow to the heart of the bond one once believed was unbreakable. My voice cracked with emotion, the tremor in it unmistakable, a clear indication that this was not just a matter of lost belongings, but of trust shattered beyond repair. Her response was immediate yet strangely detached. "It was all for our benefit," she insisted, her tone defensive, almost rehearsed. "I was trying to help, to ease some of our financial burdens." The words hung in the air, ringing hollow against the backdrop of my hurt. I stared at her, searching for any trace of sincerity, but all I found was a wall of indifference and denial. "For our benefit?" I repeated, my voice rising with disbelief. "By selling my things that you promised to keep safe? How can that possibly be for our benefit?" As I pressed, my questions slicing through the air like sharp edges, her eyes began to dart away, unable to meet mine. It was as if with every question, the woman I once knew was retreating further into a shell of defensiveness and sorrow. I thought you'd be better off," she stammered weakly, her words trailing off as if she were grasping at straws. The more I demanded an explanation, the more she clammed up, her lips pressed tightly together in silent denial. The kitchen, once a warm haven filled with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and home-cooked meals, transformed into a cold battleground. The ticking of the wall clock seemed to amplify the tension, marking every agonizing second as I stood there, my heart aching with betrayal. Clara's old photo, a reminder of happier times, lay on the counter, now an ironic relic of what we once had. I recalled the countless promises we made to each other, to always be there, to never let the world come between us, and now I felt that sacred vow slip irretrievably away. I demanded, "Why, Mom? Why would you do this?" My voice cracked as I spoke, each word laced with the pain of years of trust now broken. Her silence was the only response for a long, agonizing minute, and in that silence, I felt as if I were drowning in the betrayal. Finally, she whispered, "I did it because I thought it would help." I was trying to make things easier. Her explanation was incomplete, her sentence hanging in the air, a pathetic attempt at justification that failed to reach the depth of my anguish. Her eyes filled with unshed tears, but they offered no comfort, only a glimpse of a person I no longer recognized. The conversation that had started with anger began to dissolve into bitter silence. I wanted to scream, to demand that she understand the gravity of what she had done, but all that came out was a strangled, broken murmur. The room was filled with unspoken words, the air thick with regret and the realization that nothing I said could mend this rift. In that moment, I felt completely isolated, as if an invisible wall had sprung up between us, one that no amount of pleading or explanation could ever breach. My vision blurred as the weight of my emotions threatened to overwhelm me. The promise of unconditional love, the memories of a childhood filled with care and warmth, were now tainted by betrayal. The woman I had once trusted implicitly, who had been my safe haven, now appeared to be a stranger behind a mask of defensiveness and sorrow. I walked out of that kitchen with nothing resolved, the silence between us echoing louder than any words ever could. Each step felt heavy, burdened by the realization that our relationship had been irreversibly altered in that one heated confrontation. I left the house that day, not knowing if I was walking away permanently or merely taking a pause from a bond that now seemed fractured beyond repair. As I drove away, the images of that confrontation replayed relentlessly in my mind. I questioned every memory, every smile, every promise. I wondered if I had been naive to trust her so completely, if I had overlooked the subtle signs that now screamed in hindsight. The betrayal cut deep, and it wasn't just about the items sold or the promises broken, it was about the erosion of a trust that I believed was unassailable. I realized, with a bitter clarity, that sometimes the person you hold closest in your heart can be the one to hurt you the most. The confrontation left me with a profound sense of isolation and an overwhelming need to protect myself. I vowed then that I would no longer be a passive recipient of actions that defied respect. The conversation ended with shattered promises and a silence that spoke volumes, leaving me to wonder if our family could ever be rebuilt from the ruins of that day. In the aftermath of that painful encounter, I was forced to re-examine everything I had believed about our relationship. I was left to navigate a maze of conflicting emotions, anger, hurt, and a desperate need for answers that never seemed to come. The woman I once knew had changed, and with that change, the foundation of trust and love was irrevocably broken. And so, with a heavy heart and trembling hands, I embarked on a journey of self-preservation, knowing that I could no longer allow myself to be taken for granted by someone who had once been my everything. Unable to bear the emotional turmoil and financial devastation any longer, I realized I had no choice but to take action, a decision that tore at the very fabric of everything I once believed in. I spent that long, sleepless night methodically gathering evidence, each piece of proof a bitter reminder of the betrayal. I combed through my emails, text messages, and social media accounts until I had a trove of screenshots, images of the online listings featuring my guitar, my collection of books, and even other personal items. I saved copies of the receipts from the pawn shop, each one documenting the sale or pawning of items I had entrusted to her. With trembling fingers, I pieced together the puzzle that confirmed what I had feared all along. This wasn't a series of innocent oversights, it was a calculated, deliberate act. The next morning, my hands still shook as I organized every scrap of evidence in a neat folder on my computer. I made photocopies of the documents and printed out the screenshots, spreading them out on my dining table like the pieces of a broken heart. I couldn't stop the tears as I reviewed each item, each receipt, and each digital image was a reminder of promises broken and trust shattered. It was a grim testament to the fact that my mom had taken what was mine without remorse or hesitation. That day, my resolve hardened. I dialed the non-emergency number of the local police department, my voice wavering as I recounted the events in as much detail as I could muster. I explained how I had discovered the online listings, how my most cherished belongings were being sold as if they were nothing more than disposable trinkets, and how my laptop, my lifeline to work and creativity, had been pawned. I recounted the evidence I had collected, my words laced with a raw mixture of anger and sorrow. The officer on the other end listened quietly, his tone measured yet empathetic, and assured me that someone would be sent to investigate as soon as possible. The day the police arrived is etched into my memory with brutal clarity. I still recall the sound of the sirens echoing down the street, a cacophony of justice and regret. The blue and red lights danced across the walls of my building as the officers approached. I opened the door, my heart pounding so hard I feared it might shatter, to find them waiting, an ominous sign that my world was about to be upended. Their presence was both a relief and a source of deep sorrow. In that moment, I was no longer the trusting child who had once seen my mother as my safe haven. I was a betrayed adult, forced to face the harsh reality of familial deception. I led the officers into my apartment and carefully showed them the evidence I had collected. My voice was shaky as I explained each piece, a screenshot here, a receipt there. I could see their eyes narrowing in quiet understanding as they absorbed the magnitude of the situation. They took detailed notes, asked clarifying questions, and assured me that they would handle the matter with the seriousness it deserved. When one of the officers left to retrieve additional resources, I sank into the worn-out sofa, feeling a mix of despair and a strange sense of vindication. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I was taking steps to reclaim control over my life. Within a few hours, the police returned with reinforcements, and my mom was taken into custody. The sight of her being led away in handcuffs is seared into my mind, a haunting image that encapsulated the collapse of the bond one once held so dear. I remember her face, a tumult of emotions, shock, anger, and a hint of something that might have been regret, though it was impossible to tell. The officers were professional, and while they spoke in hushed tones, their words carried a finality that resonated deeply within me. This was no longer a private family matter. It had escalated to a point where legal action was not just necessary, it was inevitable. In the days that followed, I felt an emptiness that was as profound as it was isolating. I knew that the damage was done, that the foundation of trust between us had been irrevocably shattered. But I also knew that I could no longer allow myself to be a victim of continuous betrayal. With the police investigation underway, I took further steps to protect myself. I filed a restraining order, a legal barrier designed to keep my mom from further intruding on my life or causing additional harm. Signing the documents was one of the most painful things I've ever had to do. It felt like a final, irrevocable act of severance, a line drawn in the sand that symbolized the end of a relationship that had once meant everything to me. Every time I signed those papers, my hand trembled, and I felt the weight of the decision pressing down on me. I wondered if, in protecting myself, I was also sealing the fate of a relationship I could never get back. Yet, as the restraining order took effect, I began to realize that sometimes, protecting one's dignity and well-being requires making impossible choices. The legal process moved slowly, each step measured and methodical, and I found myself caught in a limbo of bureaucratic procedures and emotional turmoil. I spent those long days and nights reflecting on everything that had led to this point. I questioned if I had missed the signs, if I had been too naive to understand that the person I trusted the most could commit such acts. The evidence was irrefutable, yet a part of me still clung to memories of happier times, the gentle hugs, the kind words, and the assurances that had once defined our relationship. Now, every one of those memories felt tainted, a painful reminder of how deeply betrayal can cut. As I navigated the legal and emotional fallout, I found solace in the support of close friends and a counselor who helped me process the overwhelming mix of grief, anger, and relief. Each session was a journey through the labyrinth of my emotions, teaching me that while the betrayal was profound, it did not define me. I began to understand that sometimes, the only way to heal is to face the darkness head-on, even when it means dismantling the remnants of what you once held dear. Now, as I sit quietly in my apartment, surrounded by the echoes of that fateful day, the distant hum of city life, the empty silence of my once shared space, I know that my decision to take action was both necessary and transformative. It marked the beginning of a long, arduous process of reclaiming my life and rebuilding my sense of self. Even though the act of calling the cops, having my mom arrested, and filing a restraining order filled me with profound sorrow, it also ignited a spark of determination. I vowed to myself that I would not allow this betrayal to define my future, and that through the darkness, I would eventually find a path to healing and redemption. In the weeks that followed that fateful day, my world was nothing short of unrecognizable. The fallout from the police intervention and restraining order left our once familiar lives in ruins. I found myself caught in a turbulent storm of conflicting emotions. There was a sense of relief, a small flicker of hope, that I had finally taken control of a situation that had spiraled far beyond my control. Yet, that relief was inextricably intertwined with a deep, gnawing sorrow for the relationship I had once cherished so dearly. Every morning, as I woke up in the quiet of my new, lonely apartment, the absence of my mom's presence was both a comfort and a crushing reminder of what had been lost. I began spending long hours in counseling, where I would sit in a softly lit room with a compassionate therapist who helped me navigate the labyrinth of emotions that now defined my days. In those sessions, I relived the painful moments, the betrayal, the shock, and the moment I saw my precious belongings being sold off. I questioned every decision, wondering if calling the cops and filing that restraining order had been too drastic a step, or if it was, in fact, the only way to protect my dignity and reclaim control over my life. Each session was a raw confrontation with my own vulnerabilities, and I slowly learned that sometimes, the person you love the most can cause the deepest wounds. The legal proceedings themselves were a relentless, bureaucratic ordeal. I spent countless hours poring over paperwork, attending court hearings, and providing statements. It was a process that stripped away any remnants of the familial warmth I once knew, leaving behind only cold legal formalities. Every court date was a reminder that the bond one had taken for granted was now a broken contract, severed by actions I could neither undo nor ignore. The weight of these proceedings sat heavily on my shoulders, yet I knew that without them, I would remain vulnerable to further harm. As I grappled with these emotions, I began to rebuild my life piece by piece. I started by reclaiming my identity, which had been so tightly interwoven with the memories of a past I was now forced to leave behind. I retrieved what little personal belongings I still had, and each item, whether it was a favorite mug or a tattered book, became a symbol of my resilience. Slowly, I decorated my new apartment, carefully choosing each piece as a reminder that I was more than the sum of my betrayals. I made a conscious effort to create a space that was solely mine, a sanctuary where I could heal and redefine who I was without the weight of broken trust. Every day felt like a battle between lingering anger and the fragile hope for eventual healing. There were moments when the anger surged unexpectedly, triggered by a familiar scent, a song on the radio, or even the quiet hum of the city at night. In those moments, I would find myself clenching my fists or pacing the room, struggling to balance the intensity of my emotions. Yet, in the quieter moments, when the anger subsided, I would allow myself to feel the sorrow, to mourn the relationship that had crumbled before my eyes. The duality of my feelings was both confusing and painful. I was angry at the betrayal, yet part of me still longed for the connection we once had. I started writing in a journal, pouring my heart onto the pages in an attempt to make sense of the chaos within. Each entry was a raw outpouring of grief and defiance, a testament to my journey from victimhood to self-empowerment. I chronicled the small victories, the day I managed to smile without the burden of bitterness, the time I rediscovered an old hobby that once brought me joy, or even the simple act of enjoying a quiet morning coffee without the shadow of resentment hanging over me. Slowly, these entries began to form a mosaic of recovery, each word a step toward reclaiming my life. Friends, too, played a crucial role in my healing process. Their support was a balm to my wounded soul. I found solace in long, heartfelt conversations over dinner, where I could share my fears and hopes without judgment. Their encouragement reminded me that while my relationship with my mom had fractured irreparably, I was not alone. Their unwavering support gave me the strength to face each new day, even when the future looked uncertain. Yet, even as I made strides toward healing, I could not shake the lingering question that haunted me. Am I the asshole for choosing to step away from a family that once meant everything to me? It was a question that echoed in the silent hours of the night, a voice that whispered doubts even as I tried to embrace my newfound independence. I wrestled with the pain of severed ties, wondering if my actions had been too harsh or if they were, in fact, the only way to protect myself from further harm. Deep down, though, I knew that preserving my sense of self required a stand against a betrayal that had been as calculated as it was devastating. In retrospect, I realized that the aftermath of that day was not just about the legal consequences or the tangible loss of my belongings. It was about the profound transformation of my understanding of trust and family. I came to see that sometimes, love is not enough to bridge the gap when respect is eroded beyond repair. The painful journey I embarked on was as much about reclaiming my dignity as it was about coming to terms with a fractured past. Now, as I sit quietly in my apartment, reflecting on the storm of the past few months, I see a glimmer of hope amidst the ruins. I am slowly learning to forgive, not for the sake of the person who hurt me, but for my own peace of mind. I am redefining what family means to me, recognizing that sometimes, protecting oneself requires making the hardest choices. Every day is a new challenge, a delicate dance between anger and healing, sorrow and hope. And though the scars of betrayal may never fully fade, they serve as a reminder of my strength and resilience. This is my story, a raw, unfiltered journey toward reclaiming my life and redefining trust. It is a testament to the fact that even in the aftermath of profound betrayal, there lies a possibility for renewal. As I continue to navigate this complex path, I hold on to the hope that, one day, I will look back and see not just the pain, but the triumph of a spirit that refused to be broken.